Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War, and we are on to week 192. Backs to the wall. All eyes on Amiens. Now, before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I'd love it if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. And please do go check out my gaming channel here on YouTube. I upload old streams and dumb clips. Yada, yada, yada. With that said, really got nothing to, the Germans are doing their offensive. The big spring offensive. Will it work out for them? Totally don't know the answer to that one. Let's dive in.
The war in the trenches really began in the fall of 1914, after the race to the sea. For nearly 3.5 years since then, the Western Front has been in stalemate, despite a death toll in the millions. But this week, that finally changes. This week, the Germans break through.
Yay! Well, sort of yay. Yay for the Germans, not yay for the French and British. No, no, no.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, 2 new offensives began. A minor British one in Palestine, and the mother of all offensives by the Germans on the Western Front, which broke through the British lines. Both attacks continued this week. The British took Es Salt on the 25th and advanced on Amman, but it was a fiasco. The camels could not make the climb to Salt, and when the attack on Amman began the 27th, the men were exhausted, and the week ended without any successes.
Oof.
But someone was still seeing success over on the Western Front. A side note from that front first, though. Back on the 21st, shells began to fall on Paris. These came from one of the Paris guns, specially made by Krupp for the Germans, to fire on that city from a distance of over 100 kilometers.
God damn.
The shells took 4 minutes to arrive and were the first man-made objects to reach the stratosphere. When aiming the guns, the curvature of the Earth must even be considered. The worst Paris gun incident happened the 29th, when a shell collapsed the roof of a church during Good Friday services. 91 died and 68 were wounded. As for the rest of the German attack, they crossed the River Somme and the Crozat Canal.
I will say, one thing that also, kind of is a bit, can kind of see here in Germany at this time is that they also really, even before Goebbels comes in and runs the propaganda house, the Germans, even of World War I, really knew propaganda, really knew how to mess with the minds of their enemy, right? Like, shelling Paris from over 100 kilometers, that's fucking terrifying. Like, that's going to get people, like, scared and, like, talking, wanting perhaps even wanting the war to end even more so than previously, because now they are seeing an even more direct threat to their safety, for the Parisians, and I mean, the mustard gas that the Germans invented or whatever it was, they really know psychological warfare.
Since the British hadn't been able to blow the bridges, and General Hugh Gough and the British Fifth Army continued their hasty retreat. The Kaiser declared, "The battle won, the English utterly defeated." And, as you may imagine, the Allies were seriously worried at the speed of the German advance. The amazing progress so far had mostly been by Oskar von Hutier and the German 18th Army, but by the 23rd, even Georg von Marwitz's forward troops were over 20 kilometers past their starting points in the British center. Philippe Pétain and the French had by now sent 13 divisions to help stop the disintegration of Gough's army, but as they began to arrive, they too were pushed back. By the 24th, the entire British line was pulling back. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George asked the British ambassador to Washington, Lord Reading, to explain the situation of British manpower to President Wilson.
God, World War I really reads like a fucking novel. At least when you look at a typical plot structure of a novel, this is me getting into not historian but author vibes here, but right, the typical plot structure is right before the climax of the novel, you're at your darkest hour, right? The protagonists are at their darkest hour if we look at the British and French as protagonists here. Though, um, if we as Westerners, uh, an American, since the Americans are on the side of the British and French in this, where if we look at British, French, and Americans as the protagonists, um, they, this is their darkest hour essentially. And you look at how World War One really has kind of progressed. It really does kind of give the vibe of a novel of a modern-ish novel plot structure.
You should appeal to the president to drop all questions of interpretation of past agreements and send over infantry as fast as possible without transport or other encumbrance. The situation is undoubtedly critical, and if America delays now, she may be too late. Wilson received Reading at the White House, acknowledged the severity of the situation, and asked what to do. Reading told him to send a direct order to Commander John Pershing that the American troops in France should be put in brigades with French and British troops without waiting until they had sufficient numbers to make their own brigades. Wilson said that under the U.S. Constitution, he had the power to decide without consulting his cabinet, and he would give the order. Pershing had been planning to make war in 1919, but Operation Michael, the code name for the breakthrough part of the German offensive now happening, had changed his mind too. At the end of the week, he will invite the Allies to use American troops however they see fit, and the Americans will finally really be part of the fight. The Germans by now threatened to drive a wedge between the British and French armies. Over 40,000 Allied prisoners had been taken. The British line east of Amiens was in danger of being overrun, and if Amiens, a vital communications hub, fell, the British army would be cut off from the ports of Rouen and Le Havre, not to mention being separated from the French. A special force of 3,000 men was
Let's take a look at that map here. Let's take a little gander at this map here. What's interesting about this is where we kind of see the British get cut off and surrounded in World War One. If I recall those maps correctly from past videos we've watched, they essentially get cut off around this same area. It's just kind of, I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say here with that acknowledgement, but it's just kind of funny in a way. The things that the Germans are fighting for here and failing at, but they absolutely succeed in doing it in World War II. Now, of course, circumstances are a hell of a lot different from World War I to World War II that need to be, of course, addressed when saying this. I've got the fucking time for that, nor do I care to, because y'all already know. I don't need to explain it. But yeah, it's just kind of funny in a way.
The French. A special force of 3,000 men was assembled to help hold the line. This force included 500 American railway engineers thrown in out of desperation.
Ugh.
German Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff did not, however, send his armies against that major prize just then. Instead, he sent them in 3 directions. Von Below was now given reserves and told to head north. Marwitz was to head west on a line between Arras and Amiens. Hutier was to head southward towards Noyon and Paris. In A World Undone, G.J. Meyer thinks the only explanation for this is that Ludendorff thought he could beat both his enemies at once with separating and enveloping movements. This was beyond German capability, though it brings to mind the campaigns of Konrad von Hotzendorf, who had wrecked the Austro-Hungarian armies with theoretically brilliant but unrealistic lunges at instant glory.
No.
On March 25th, the Germans broke through between the British and French armies and took Noyon and Bapaume. That day, the decision was made in the Allied high commands to give French Marshal Ferdinand Foch overall command of the forces. There's some detail behind this. British commander Sir Douglas Haig had learned to his dismay that if the Germans continued to advance, the French would fall back to the south, and the 2 armies would be truly split. This was not Pétain's choice. He had been ordered by the French cabinet to defend Paris at all costs and as sole priority. Haig also knew, though, that if there was a supreme commander of the Entente forces, Foch would likely get the job, and he would be much more willing to advance north instead of retiring south. So Haig was all for it. On the 26th, Foch was given responsibility for the Western Front. The first thing he did was order the French army holding Saint-Michel to head to Amiens. Pétain suggested a line 30 kilometers back and not in front of the town. Foch said, "We must fight in front of Amiens. We must stop where we are now. As we have not been able to stop the Germans on the Somme, we must not retire a single centimeter." Ludendorff finally realized how major Amiens was. He ordered Marwitz to link his left with Hutier's right and take it. But the Germans were also hitting the French hard at the Aisne. In fact, they drove the French back across it and forced them back towards the Marne.
This is insane. I didn't know. So what's so interesting about that, you hear about this German spring of 1918 offensive in history class, but because it ultimately does not work out, it's kind of glossed over and just forgotten about, not discussed. But because of this show and spending week by week, right, we are seeing the lack of movement along the Western Front. We are going through it here. I can only imagine what this must have been like to kind of be watching this show genuinely week by week as it was coming out during the 100-year anniversary of World War One. God, that would have been so crazy to be then witnessing this kind of as the week. Oh man, I missed out. But right after 192 weeks, we are seeing this much movement in a single fucking week. And because of how it's so zoomed in, and we can really get a very good, clear picture on how close Paris is to the German front line. Because you hear in class, the Germans were this far away from Paris, which when you hear a number followed by they were this many kilometers away, it still kind of sounds like a lot. Just because of how at least my brain works. I don't know if everyone else is like that, but whenever I hear numbers and then kilometer or miles, my brain is instantly like, okay, that's a good bit away. This, technically, yes, is a good bit away. But when we look at how far the Germans have pushed in just this 1 week with the 18th Army here, where they pushed from Saint Quentin or Saint Quentin, whatever the fuck you want to pronounce it, if they were to do that same amount, but just south, they'd be in Paris. Right? Seeing it like this really just helps. This is just amazing. I love this. I love this fucking show.
It was September 1914 all over again. On the 27th, they pushed the French from Montdidier, just 80 kilometers from Paris. However, that day, near Noyon, the French stopped the Germans. Also that day, the British took 800 German prisoners on the Somme. Okay, the gap between the British and French was still over 15 kilometers wide, but still. At the end of last week, the Germans launched Operation Mars on both sides of the Scarpe River, but that was a failure and was shut down immediately. On the 28th, Gough was removed from command of the 5th Army and left the front the 29th. In the British House of Commons a couple of weeks from now, Lloyd George will skewer Gough and the 5th Army for their failure. The lack of manpower, the nature of the attack, and the fierce resistance of the defenders will go unmentioned. I got to admit,
Gough, all right, attacking the rest of the 5th Army, uncalled for, Lloyd George. But scathing Hugh Gough, valid.
For all of his shortcomings in earlier offensives that I've repeatedly talked about, I think this was very unfair to Gough. I doubt there was a general on Earth who could have held the line with what he had against what he had to face.
Fair.
Ludendorff...
But Haig is still in command. Haig is a worse offender than Gough, in my opinion, based on what I remember the two.
all of the gains, was seeing the real weakness of his attack force by the middle of the week. He wasn't able to pursue and run down the defeated British. The German cavalry was still in the east with the big open spaces. Ludendorff didn't have enough tanks or enough armored cars to do anything quickly. Germany had no access to rubber, and the steel wheels of the car.
And what I also love about this is not only is it what what we really see here too is like right where the British and French are weak right now is like the same area that they are weak in World War II, and where the Nazis are able to push through. And then what we see the Germans struggling with here in World War One is what they will struggle with in World War II. The lack of vehicles and rubber. Like, oh man. When you look at it that way, the argument for saying that there was only one world war, it was just a ceasefire of like 20 years. When you look at these conditions like that, you can kind of see that argument. I still don't believe in that argument because of just the sheer difference in government and worldly politics from World War One to World War II. Vastly different, but when you look at it through a certain lens, you can certainly see the argument.
Ludendorff did
a
have
little bit
destroyed
of
the roads they used.
legs.
Hutier's men could only go as fast as they could walk, and they'd been walking and fighting for a week now. Still, on the 26th and 27th, they advanced 30 kilometers total, and towards the end of the week, the Allied retreat continued everywhere except Amiens, where the French and British reserves were pouring in, and the Germans were waiting for their heavy guns to catch up. As the week ended, all the focus and the entire meaning, the entire value of Operation Michael was on Amiens. The world was watching. One of the British soldiers killed during the fighting on the 24th was Lieutenant R.B. Marriott Watson, son of the novelist H.P. He wrote the short poem Kismet, which I will close with here. Opal fires in the western sky, for that which is written must ever be. And a bullet comes droning, whining by, to the heart of a sentry close to me. For some go early, some go late. A dying scream on the evening air, and who is there that believes in fate as a soul goes out in the sunset flare? If you want to learn more about the race to the sea in 1914, you can check out our weekly episode about that right here. Our
Week 9. Oh my god. Y'all remember that one? This was the Great War week 192. Backs to the wall. All eyes on Amiens. This, I think, might be my favorite episode of this show so far. And I'm kind of curious. I have a feeling, my guess is it might be my favorite just because of, one, this is a great episode, right? With all that is happening, right? But it's because of we're getting kind of, if you want to look at it from a narrative perspective, a storytelling perspective, we are getting payoff to all the things that have been really set up, right? We get, before this point, with the other times we've had a bunch of setup, right? Like the setup for the Somme, or the setup for Verdun, or the short setup for, other offensives and things like that. They've ultimately not succeeded, right? So there isn't, right, much narrative satisfaction as an audience for them from a storytelling perspective, because all that setup that we had to listen to and watch ultimately proved fruitless. Right now, of course, it's good to hear that information anyway, just as to get a general understanding of the war and how it's progressing. But from a storytelling perspective here, we are getting our payoff for the time spent on hearing about the Germans preparing for this big offensive in the West. And we are getting the payoff for that because the Germans right now are succeeding. And so it's narratively satisfying because the Germans have proven more often than not, compared to the other powers, that they are the competent ones, right? You want to kind of root. It's why some villains are more popular than the heroes, because sometimes accidentally, the author will end up having written a villain that comes across as way more competent than the hero. And we want to root for the people that are competent a lot of the time, right? Um so, you know, just intrinsically here with what I think appeals to me from a narrative perspective, right? It's very satisfying to be seeing the Germans succeed in this spring offensive because they have been the competent ones, and the payoff satisfaction for them, all that time spent building up, etc. for this. This was a great episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.